Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Erich Neumann, the architect of consciousness evolution. Together and apart, they trace the emergence of human awareness from its primordial depths through mythic ages to the threshold of modern selfhood. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the birth of consciousness, one seeing archetypal patterns emerging spontaneously from the collective depths, the other discovering a grand historical progression through which awareness gradually separated itself from the originating matrix of being. Their dialogue, whether spoken across cafe tables in Zurich or across continents through letters and manuscripts, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Neumann, as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. The year is 1948, and in Tel Aviv, a German Jewish psychologist sits at a small desk overlooking streets still dusty from recent construction, streets that pulse with the complex hope and trauma of a newborn state. Erich Neumann has survived what cannot be survived, has crossed from one world into another, carrying with him manuscripts and dreams, theories, memories. In his hands, he holds a letter from Carl Jung, written from the safety and silence of Bollingen, Jung's tower retreat on the shores of Lake Zurich. The letter responds to pages Neumann has sent, pages that will eventually become The Origins and History of Consciousness, a book that will attempt something extraordinary, to map the development of human awareness itself, to trace consciousness from its first glimmering in the vast oceanic unconscious through mythological stages until it arrives, trembling and uncertain, at individual selfhood. Jung's response to these early pages is warm, encouraging, yet also carefully measured. He recognizes in Neumann a kindred spirit, someone who has truly understood the symbolic language of the psyche, who sees in myth not primitive fantasy but the very structure of psychological development. Yet Jung also senses something in Neumann's approach that differs from his own, a systematic quality, an evolutionary framework, a desire to place the timeless archetypes into a temporal sequence. Where Jung has always emphasized the simultaneity of archetypal reality, its eternal presence beneath and within consciousness, Neumann wishes to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and direction. He wishes to show how consciousness emerges, step by step, from its origins in what he will call the Ouroboros, the circular serpent eating its own tail, symbol of the original unified state before differentiation, before the terrible and necessary separation of ego from the unconscious matrix. To understand this dialogue between Jung and Neumann, we must first step back into Jung's own journey, into the formation of his ideas about archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the process of individuation. Carl Jung was born in 1875 in Kesswil, Switzerland, into a world still resonating with 19th century certainties, yet already beginning to fracture at the edges. His father was a pastor, a man of faith who, struggled with doubt, and Jung grew up in an atmosphere saturated with religious questions, dreams that felt more real than waking life, and a sense that beneath the surface of ordinary existence lay depths that both attracted and terrified. Jung's early career brought him into contact with psychiatric patients at the Bergholzli Hospital in Zurich, where he worked under Eugen Bleuler. There, Jung encountered minds fragmented by psychosis, patients whose inner worlds erupted into consciousness in ways that revealed patterns, repeated symbols, mythic imagery that seemed to arise independent of personal experience or education. A patient who had never read mythology would speak of ancient gods. An illiterate woman would describe cosmological visions that paralleled Gnostic texts Jung himself had only recently discovered. These experiences planted seeds of a radical idea that beneath personal memory and experience lay a deeper layer of psyche, a collective stratum shared by all. Humanity, expressed through universal symbols and patterns, he would eventually call archetypes. The relationship with Sigmund Freud, beginning in 1906, initially seemed to promise a collaboration that might revolutionize psychology, but fundamental differences emerged. Where Freud saw libido as primarily sexual energy and traced neurosis back to personal childhood experiences and repressions, Jung increasingly perceived psychic energy as more broadly spiritual and creative, and saw in his patient's symptoms connections to transpersonal, mythological motifs. The break, when it came in 1912 and 13, was painful for both men, but it freed Jung to follow his own path deeper into the collective dimensions of psyche. The period following the break with Freud plunged Jung into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. Years of intense inner experience between 1913 and 1919, when he deliberately opened himself to fantasies, visions, and personified figures from the depths of his own psyche. He recorded these experiences in what would become the Red Book, a manuscript of extraordinary beauty and strangeness, illuminated with mandalas and images, filled with dialogues with inner figures like Philemon, a wise ancient figure with kingfisher wings, who taught Jung that thoughts could be autonomous, that the psyche contained entities and layers beyond ego control. From this crucible of personal experience, Jung developed his mature psychology. The collective unconscious was not merely theoretical but experientially real to him, a vast reservoir of potentials, patterns, and primordial images shared across humanity. Archetypes were the deep structures of this collective psyche: the mother, the father, the hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self. These were not learned but innate, expressing themselves through dreams, myths, religious symbols, and psychotic visions with remarkable consistency across cultures and epochs. Jung's method, as it developed through the 1920s and 30s, involved careful attention to the symbolic productions of the psyche. He would ask patients to paint their dreams, to follow active imagination into dialogue with inner figures, to trace the appearance of archetypal motifs through their symptoms and life stories. His approach was amplification, taking a dream image and surrounding it with parallel images from world mythology, alchemy, religion, and art, allowing the archetypal dimension to become visible, showing the patient how their personal suffering participated in transpersonal patterns of meaning. Crucially, Jung did not arrange archetypes in a developmental sequence. For him, they existed simultaneously, like organs in a body or constellations in a sky, each available to consciousness depending on life circumstances and individual development. The mother archetype could appear in infancy, but also at midlife, when a man confronted his anima, or in old age, when one contemplated death and returned to the source. The hero archetype was not merely a stage of youthful ego development, but a recurring pattern whenever consciousness faced overwhelming challenge. Archetypes were eternal structures, not historical phases. Yet Jung did develop one crucial developmental framework: the process of individuation. This was the movement toward psychological wholeness, the gradual integration of unconscious contents into consciousness, the reconciliation of opposites within the personality, culminating in the realization of the self, the archetype of totality and order. Individuation typically began in earnest during the second half of life, when the goals of youth, achievement, family, social identity no longer fully satisfied, and a person was drawn inward toward questions of meaning, wholeness, and spiritual integration. Jung's work through the 1930s and 40s expanded into alchemy, seeing in the medieval alchemists' cryptic imagery a symbolic representation of psychological transformation. He explored synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that suggested a connection between psyche and matter beyond causality. His psychological types, first published in 1921, described fundamental orientations of consciousness: introversion and extroversion, thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. His work was vast, sprawling, following the organic unpredictability of symbolic material rather than systematic philosophical argument. By the time World War II ended, Jung was 70 years old, established as one of the great psychological thinkers of the century, yet still engaged, still developing his ideas, still open to talented students who might carry analytical psychology forward in new directions. He had gathered around him a circle of analysts and intellectuals at the Jung Institute in Zurich, founded in 1948. Among those drawn into Jung's orbit during these post-war years was Erich Neumann, though their relationship had begun earlier, before the war scattered so many lives and destroyed so many worlds. Erich Neumann was born in 1905 in Berlin, 30 years Jung's junior. Born into a German Jewish family at a time when such an identity seemed compatible with German culture. When Jewish intellectuals participated fully in the extraordinary flowering of German philosophy, science, and arts, Neumann's childhood was comfortable, intellectual, urban. He studied medicine and philosophy at the University of Berlin, receiving his doctorate in 1927 with a dissertation on the ontological sources of artistic creation, a work that already showed his preoccupation with origins, with the deep sources from which human creativity emerges. The late 1920s and early 30s in Berlin were years of intense intellectual ferment and increasing political darkness. Neumann encountered Jung's work during his medical studies, and something in Jung's approach to the unconscious, his valorization of symbolic thinking, his respect for myth and religion as expressions of psychological truth, resonated deeply with Neumann's own sensibility. Here was a psychology that did not reduce spiritual experience to neurotic symptom, but recognized in it genuine encounter with the depths of psyche. In 1933, everything changed. Hitler's rise to power made Germany increasingly dangerous for Jews. Neumann, recently married to Julie Cornelia Lang, herself interested in psychology and analysis, had completed further training in analytical psychology and was establishing himself as a therapist and thinker. But the Nazi regime made professional life impossible. Jewish doctors were banned from practice. Intellectual life was poisoned by ideology and violence. Neumann and his wife made the difficult decision to leave Germany. They emigrated to Palestine in 1930, settling in Tel Aviv. This transplantation was traumatic in ways both obvious and subtle. Neumann left behind his native language, culture, professional network, and the European intellectual world that had nourished his development. He arrived in a small, struggling Jewish community in Palestine, where psychological services were barely established, where the daily challenges of building a new society in difficult conditions left little room for the refined intellectual pursuits of European analysis. Yet this displacement also freed Neumann in certain ways. Removed from the immediate presence of Jung and the Zurich Circle, working in Hebrew and English as well as German, Neumann had space to develop his own vision. The experience of rupture, of leaving one world for another, of witnessing the destruction of European Jewish culture from afar, undoubtedly influenced his later theoretical preoccupation with separation, with the necessary and painful emergence of ego consciousness from original unity, with the violence and loss inherent in psychological development. Throughout the late 1930s and the war years, Neumann maintained correspondence with Jung, though postal connections were uncertain and dangerous. He continued his practice of analytical psychology, treating patients in Tel Aviv, thinking deeply about the structure and development of consciousness. He read voraciously in mythology, archaeology, and comparative religion, seeking patterns in how different cultures imagined creation, the emergence of gods and humans, the relationship between masculine and feminine principles. The war ended, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry, including many of Neumann's relatives and friends who had not escaped. This knowledge of mass trauma, of psyche and culture shattered on an unprecedented scale, gave urgency to Neumann's theoretical work. If consciousness was fragile, if it could collapse back into barbarism so easily, then understanding how consciousness emerges and develops, what threatens it and what strengthens it, became not merely an academic question but an existential necessity. In 1949, Neumann published The Origins and History of Consciousness, originally in German, later translated into English. This book was his masterwork, an attempt to synthesize Jung's archetypal psychology with an evolutionary framework, showing how consciousness gradually emerges from the unconscious through a series of mythologically encoded stages. The book was dedicated to Jung, and Jung wrote an approving foreword, yet the work represented something significantly different from Jung's own approach, a systematization and historicization that Jung himself had always resisted. Neumann proposed that the evolution of consciousness follows a pattern reflected in both cultural mythology and individual psychological development. He began with the Ouroboros, named after the ancient symbol of the serpent eating its own tail, representing the original state of undifferentiated psyche before the emergence of consciousness. In this state, there is no separation between self and world, no distinction between inside and outside, conscious and unconscious, subject and object. The infant lives in such a state, merged with the mother, unaware of itself as a separate entity, and humanity, in its earliest stages, existed in such participation mystique with nature, with tribe, with the enveloping totality. The first stage of emergence from the Ouroboros is what Neumann called the Great Mother stage. Here, consciousness begins to differentiate, but remains dependent on and contained within the matrix from which it emerges. The Great Mother archetype appears in all its ambivalence, nurturing and devouring, creative and destructive, the source of life and the mouth of death. Mythologically, This appears in figures like Tiamat, the Babylonian mother goddess whose body is split to create the world, or Kali, who gives birth and consumes, or the Egyptian Isis, or countless other goddesses who represent the containing, overwhelming feminine principle. Neumann argued that consciousness, in both cultural history and individual development, must separate from this maternal matrix through what he called the hero myth. The hero's journey, the son who must leave the mother, fight the dragon, descend to the underworld, and establish independent identity, is the central myth of ego development. This separation is necessary, but involves violence, loss, and guilt. The dragon the hero fights is often a negative manifestation of the Great Mother, the devouring aspect that threatens to reabsorb the emerging consciousness. Perseus slaying Medusa, Marduk defeating Tiamat, Theseus killing the Minotaur. These myths encode the psychological necessity and danger of consciousness separating from its unconscious origins. Crucially, Neumann recognized that early consciousness is predominantly masculine in character, associated with light, sun, discriminating thought, separation, and individual identity, while the unconscious from which it emerges is predominantly feminine, associated with darkness, moon, undifferentiated wholeness, connection, and collective identity. This gendering of consciousness and unconscious was controversial even then, and has become more so, yet Neumann insisted it was not about literal men and women, but about fundamental psychological principles that operate in both sexes. The hero stage, in Neumann's framework, represents patriarchal consciousness, the establishment of ego identity through opposition to and domination over the unconscious and nature. This is a necessary but incomplete development. Mythologically, it corresponds to sky-father gods like Zeus or Yahweh, displacing earlier Earth Mother goddesses. Psychologically, it corresponds to the ego establishing its autonomy, its capacity for rational thought and willful action. But Neumann, following Jung, recognized that such one-sided patriarchal consciousness is not the endpoint of development. True maturity requires reintegration with the feminine principle, not regressing back to the Euroboric state of unconsciousness, but achieving a higher union that preserves ego consciousness while reconnecting with the creative depths of the unconscious. This later stage of development Neumann associated with the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, the union of masculine and feminine principles at a higher level. Mythologically, this appears in the marriage of god and goddess, the alchemical conjunctio, the mystical union with the divine beloved. This is essentially what Jung meant by individuation, the reconciliation of opposites within the personality, the conscious integration of unconscious contents, the realization of wholeness. But Neumann had given Jung's process a temporal framework, a developmental sequence. Ouroboros, Great Mother, Hero, Sacred, Marriage. He suggested this sequence unfolds both historically as humanity's consciousness evolved over millennia, and ontogenetically as each individual psyche develops from infancy through adulthood. Neumann's framework was powerfully comprehensive and explanatory. It allowed Jung's sometimes bewildering array of archetypal symbols to be organized into a coherent narrative. It connected psychological development to the evolution of culture and mythology. It explained why certain mythic motifs appeared at certain historical periods, and it provided a developmental map for analytical therapists working with patients, helping them understand where a patient was stuck in consciousness development and what mythic patterns might guide therapeutic work. Yet Neumann's framework also represented a significant departure from Jung's approach. Jung had always resisted placing archetypes in a fixed sequence. He emphasized their simultaneity, their eternal availability, their contextual activation rather than stage-based emergence. For Jung, a person might encounter the shadow at any time, might experience the divine child archetype in old age, might live the hero myth at 60 as much as at 20. The psyche was not a ladder, climbed rung by rung, but a vast landscape traversed according to individual life circumstances and inner necessity. Moreover, Jung was cautious about equating psychological development with cultural evolution. He recognized that so-called primitive peoples might have psychological sophistication that modern consciousness had lost. He saw that medieval alchemists understood certain symbolic truths that Enlightenment rationalism had destroyed. Jung's view of history was less progressive than cyclical or compensatory, each age developing certain potentials while losing others, with the psyche always seeking balance through compensation. Neumann, shaped by the progressive assumptions of his time, by evolutionary biology, by the developmental frameworks of Piaget and other psychologists, and perhaps by his own experience of historical rupture and displacement, imposed a more linear trajectory onto consciousness. He saw history moving from unconscious participation to conscious separation to conscious reintegration, from matriarchy to patriarchy to potential synthesis. This was not simple progress. He recognized the losses and dangers at each stage, but it was directional in a way Jung's psychology was not. The relationship between Jung and Neumann during the years following the origins and history of consciousness was complex and warm. Jung genuinely appreciated Neumann's work, recognized his brilliance, and supported his efforts to expand analytical psychology. Neumann made regular visits to Zurich, presented at Jung Institute conferences, corresponded extensively with Jung about theoretical and clinical matters, and became one of the most prominent members of the international Jungian community. Yet there were also tensions, mostly unspoken. Jung's foreword to Neumann's book, while positive, contained subtle reservations. He praised Neumann's scholarship and synthetic ability, but carefully noted that archetypes do not unfold in a fixed historical sequence in the way Neumann suggested. He emphasized that Neumann's framework was one possible map, useful for certain purposes, but not the definitive structure of consciousness development. Neumann continued writing throughout the 1950s, producing works that further elaborated his vision. The Great Mother, an analysis of the archetype, published in 1955, was an exhaustive study of mother symbolism across cultures and epochs, tracing the goddess in all her forms from prehistoric fertility figures through classical mythology to medieval Madonnas. This book demonstrated Neumann's extraordinary erudition and his ability to synthesize vast amounts of material into coherent archetypal analysis. It also deepened his contribution to understanding the feminine in psychology, expanding and sometimes correcting Jung's own treatment of feminine archetypes. Neumann argued that Jung's concept of the anima, the feminine aspect in a man's psyche, was too narrow, too focused on the anima as the man's sole image and guide to his own unconscious. Neumann wanted to explore the Great Mother archetype as a universal structure affecting both men and women, as the foundational matrix of all psychic life. He distinguished between the good mother and the terrible mother, and between the elementary character of the feminine, the containing, nourishing, holding aspect, and the transformative character, the inspiring, creative, spiritual aspect. This more differentiated analysis of feminine archetypal symbolism became foundational for later developments in Jungian psychology. Another crucial work was The Child, co-authored with Jung in 1953, though primarily Neumann's contribution. This explored the archetype of the divine child, appearing in myths of miraculous births, in images of the Christ child, in fairy tale youngest sons who triumph through innocence and magic. Neumann connected this archetype to both the beginning and the goal of development, the child as original potential and as symbol of renewed wholeness, the beginning of consciousness and the promise of transformation. In-Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, published in 1949, Neumann confronted directly the question the Holocaust had forced upon any ethical thinker. How could civilized humanity commit such atrocities, and what psychology might prevent their recurrence? Neumann argued that traditional Judeo-Christian ethics, based on identifying with the good and repressing the shadow, had failed catastrophically. Such one-sided morality only strengthened the shadow by denying it consciousness, causing it to erupt with greater violence when collective pressure weakened individual defenses. Neumann proposed that a new ethic must be based on accepting responsibility for the shadow, acknowledging the darkness within consciousness rather than projecting it onto others. Only by integrating the shadow individually could humanity avoid the collective catastrophes of scapegoating and genocide. This was essentially an application of Jungian individuation ethics to collective psychology and history, arguing that personal psychological work had direct political and moral significance. Jung read this work with great interest and some concern. He agreed with Neumann's diagnosis, but worried that Neumann's language might be misunderstood, that calling for a new ethic might sound like moral relativism rather than the deeper morality that comes from genuine self-knowledge. Jung always maintained that ethics emerged naturally from individuation, from the encounter with the self, rather than from rational principles or commandments. Neumann was saying something similar, but his language of progressive consciousness evolution toward new ethical stages made Jung slightly uneasy, suggesting as it did that earlier ethics were simply superseded rather than deepened. By the late 1950s, Neumann's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with kidney disease, and his condition gradually worsened. He continued working, teaching, treating patients, and writing despite increasing physical limitation. His later essays explored themes of mysticism, creativity, and the psychology of art, always seeking to show how individual creative expression connected to archetypal structures and consciousness evolution. Erich Neumann died on November 5, 1960, at age 55, his brilliant career cut short. Jung, then 85 and himself in declining health, mourned the loss of one of his most gifted students and colleagues. Jung would die the following year, on June 6, 1961, bringing the generation of founders to a close and leaving the development of analytical psychology to their students and successors. The relationship between Jung and Neumann was never that of equals the 30-year age gap. Jung's status as founder and master, and Neumann's geographical distance from Zurich all ensured a teacher-student dynamic. Yet, it was also a relationship of genuine intellectual partnership, of mutual respect and influence. Neumann understood Jung's symbolic psychology more deeply than almost any other follower. He took Jung's insights and gave them systematic form, historical depth, and developmental coherence that Jung himself never achieved or desired. And in doing so, Neumann revealed both the power and the limitations of Jung's archetypal vision, showing what happened when eternal patterns were placed into evolutionary time. Now, let us drift deeper into the substance of their dialogue, into the specific convergences and divergences of their thought, into the places where their minds met in understanding and the places where their visions diverged toward different horizons. At the heart of both Jung's and Neumann's psychology lies the archetype, but the meaning and function of archetypes differs subtly, yet significantly, between them. For Jung, archetypes are structures of the collective unconscious, inherited predispositions to form certain kinds of images and experience certain kinds of psychological patterns. They are comparable to instincts, not learned behaviors, but innate potentials that manifest in typical forms across cultures and epochs. The mother archetype, for instance, is not a single image, but a pattern of experience that constellates around the reality of biological and psychological mothering, manifesting through countless cultural variations. Demeter, Mary, Isis, Kuan Yin, the fairy godmother, the witch. Jung insisted that we never encounter the archetype itself, but only its images and effects. The archetype is like an invisible pattern, like the axial structure of a crystal that determines how it forms, but is not itself visible. What we see are archetypal images, dream symbols, mythic narratives, religious visions, the varied manifestations of the underlying archetypal structure. The archetype itself remains in the unconscious, a hypothetical construct to explain the extraordinary consistency of symbolic patterns across humanity. Moreover, Jung emphasized that archetypes are not static. They are dynamic, numinous, autonomous. When activated, an archetype seizes consciousness with tremendous energy, overwhelming ego control. Falling in love activates the anima or animus, projecting the soul image onto another person with irrational intensity. A crisis of meaning activates the self, constellating dreams and synchronicities that guide toward transformation. Archetypes are experienced as powers, as divine or demonic forces, before consciousness learns to relate to them symbolically and integrate their energy. Jung also insisted on the ambivalence of archetypes. The mother is nurturing and devouring. The father is protecting and devouring. Authority and tyrant. The hero is courageous and inflated. Savior and destroyer. Every archetype contains its opposite, and consciousness must learn to hold this tension, to relate to both poles without identifying with one and repressing the other. The goal of individuation is not to transcend archetypes, but to know them, to distinguish ego from archetype, and to develop conscious relationship with these inner powers. For Jung, archetypes exist simultaneously and eternally. A person at any age might encounter any archetype depending on life circumstances. A child experiences the self through the divine child archetype. An adolescent meets the shadow as they encounter their own darker impulses. A young adult contends with the hero journey of establishing independence. A person at midlife confronts the anima or animus, discovering the contrasexual dimension of their psyche. An elder may experience the wise old man or woman, the archetype of meaning and spiritual wisdom. But these are not fixed stages. Life circumstances determine which archetypes become active. A young person might have profound wisdom and experience the wise old man in dreams. An elderly person might be called to a hero's journey of radical change. Neumann accepted Jung's basic framework but wanted to organize it differently, to show that while archetypes exist eternally, they emerge in consciousness according to a developmental logic. His central insight was that the relationship between ego and unconscious, between consciousness and the archetypal depths, evolves through predictable stages that are reflected in both mythology and individual development. The starting point, for Neumann, is the Ouroboros, the great round of containing unconsciousness. This is not, itself, an archetype, but rather the state before archetypal differentiation, the primordial wholeness that contains all potential, but has not yet separated into distinct forms. Symbolically, the Ouroboros is represented by the self-consuming serpent, by images of paradise, by the cosmic egg, by the ocean or womb containing all life. Psychologically, it corresponds to the infant's consciousness before the development of ego, and to humanity's earliest consciousness before the differentiation of self and world. In the Ouroboric state, there is no subject-object distinction, no individual identity, no capacity for reflection. Experience is immediate, undifferentiated, overwhelmingly whole. There is comfort in this state, the containment, the absence of loneliness or responsibility, but also no freedom, no growth, no consciousness in the proper sense. The first differentiation emerges as the Great Mother. This is the first archetypal structure to constellate for emerging consciousness, because consciousness initially experiences itself as contained within a larger reality, the infant within the mother, early humanity, within nature, individual awareness within the unconscious. The Great Mother is the first other that consciousness perceives, though at first not as truly separate, but as the encompassing whole within which consciousness exists. Neumann devoted enormous attention to the Great Mother archetype, far more than Jung had, because he saw it as foundational to all subsequent development. He distinguished multiple aspects. The elementary character of the feminine refers to the containing, holding, nourishing aspects, the mother as vessel, as earth, as home. This has both positive and negative poles, the good mother who nurtures life and the terrible mother who smothers and devours. The transformative character of the feminine refers to the inspiring, creative, spiritual aspects, the muse, the anima, the soul, Sophia. This too has positive and negative aspects, the inspiring feminine that elevates consciousness, and the seductive feminine that leads consciousness to destruction. Neumann mapped these distinctions onto a mandala-like structure, showing the interrelationships among different goddess forms across cultures. Demeter, goddess of grain and nurturing mother, searching for her daughter Persephone, represents the elementary good mother. Kali, with her necklace of skulls and blood-red tongue, represents the elementary terrible mother. Sophia, divine wisdom, represents the transformative good mother. The sirens, or Lorelei, luring men to destruction, represent the transformative terrible mother. This is more systematic than Jung, who discussed the mother archetype and the anima but never created such a comprehensive typology. Neumann's framework allows for much more precise analysis of how a person relates to feminine symbolism, what aspects are integrated or repressed, and where psychological work might focus. But crucially, for Neumann, consciousness cannot remain in relationship to the Great Mother. To develop, ego consciousness must separate from the maternal matrix through the hero myth. This is the central drama of consciousness development, enacted endlessly in mythology and in individual life. The hero is the emerging ego, initially identified with consciousness itself. The dragon or monster the hero must fight is the negative mother, the devouring aspect that threatens to reabsorb consciousness back into unconsciousness. Neumann traced this hero myth through its stages. The miraculous birth of the hero, often from a virgin or through divine intervention, symbolizing consciousness's mysterious emergence from the unconscious. the hero's extraordinary childhood, beset by dangers, surviving through cleverness or magic, representing the precariousness of early consciousness, the encounter with the dragon or monster, the central battle representing ego's struggle against the threat of regression, the rescue of the captive, often a princess held by the dragon, representing consciousness's liberation of creative potential from the unconscious, the hero's kingship or marriage, representing ego's establishment of stable identity in relation to the opposite. This is the mythic pattern underlying countless stories: Perseus rescuing Andromeda, Theseus and the Minotaur, Siegfried and the Dragon, Street George, Beowulf, Jason and the Fleece. Neumann argued these stories are not just entertaining tales, but essential psychological scripts showing consciousness how to emerge from and differentiate from the unconscious matrix. Jung certainly discussed hero myths extensively, but he saw them as always available, as an archetypal pattern that activates whenever consciousness faces overwhelming challenge, not specifically as the story of ego's first separation from the unconscious. Jung might see a 60-year-old person living a hero myth in facing death or radical life change. Neumann placed the hero myth primarily at a specific developmental moment, the establishment of patriarchal ego consciousness. This leads to another key difference: Neumann's historical dimension. He argued that just as individual consciousness develops through these stages, so too has human consciousness evolved historically. The earliest cultures, in Neumann's view, were dominated by Euroboric consciousness participation mystique, with nature, with tribe, with the containing whole. Archaeological evidence from the Paleolithic, with its Venus figurines and Earth Mother symbolism, suggested cultures centered on the Great Mother archetype. The emergence of patriarchal consciousness, beginning in the Bronze Age with the rise of sky father gods and hero myths, represented humanity's collective movement into the hero stage, the establishment of individual identity, rational thought, law, and civilization based on the differentiation from and domination of nature. The great patriarchal religions, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, with their emphasis on one transcendent sky father god, on law and commandment, on the split between spirit and matter, represent the hero stage of consciousness at its fullest development. But this patriarchal consciousness, while necessary for ego development, is one-sided and dangerous. It represses the feminine, splits spirit from matter, elevates consciousness at the cost of denigrating the body and nature and the unconscious. This produces a culture out of balance, destructive of the natural world, alienated from the depths of psyche, prone to shadow projection and collective violence. Neumann saw the task of contemporary consciousness as achieving a synthesis, a reintegration with the feminine principle at a higher level that preserves ego autonomy. This is the meaning of the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, the alchemical conjunctio, the reunion of masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, consciousness and unconscious, ego and self, not regressing to unconscious fusion, but achieving conscious wholeness. This developmental framework provided Neumann with a powerful interpretive lens for understanding not just individual psychology, but cultural history, religious evolution, and contemporary crises. The ecological destruction wrought by industrial civilization could be understood as the consequence of one-sided patriarchal consciousness treating nature as mere matter to exploit. The Holocaust could be understood as a catastrophic eruption of the collective shadow when patriarchal consciousness rigidified into totalitarian control. The search for new forms of spirituality in the 20th century could be understood as the stirring toward reintegration with the feminine and the unconscious. Jung appreciated this synthetic vision, but remained cautious about its historical claims. He was deeply skeptical of simple evolutionary narratives. He recognized that so-called primitive peoples often had sophisticated symbolic systems and deep spiritual wisdom that modern consciousness had lost. He saw that alchemy, medieval mysticism, and ancient Gnostic texts contained psychological insights that Enlightenment rationalism had destroyed. For Jung, history was not progressive but compensatory. Each era develops certain aspects of consciousness while losing others, and the unconscious always works to restore balance through dreams, symptoms, and cultural movements. Moreover, Jung resisted the gendering of consciousness and unconscious as straightforwardly as Neumann proposed. While Jung certainly associated consciousness with masculine symbolism and the unconscious with feminine symbolism in certain contexts, he also emphasized that every man contains the feminine anima, and every woman contains the masculine animus. For Jung, the psyche of any individual is androgynous, containing both masculine and feminine principles, and individuation requires integrating both, regardless of biological sex. Neumann was aware of this, but argued that the collective structures of consciousness and unconscious themselves had archetypal gender, even though individuals of either sex contain both. The ego consciousness that separates from the unconscious has masculine character in its active, discriminating, separating qualities. The unconscious matrix has feminine character in its containing, unifying, receptive qualities. This does not mean men are only conscious and women only unconscious. Both sexes must develop ego consciousness, and both must reintegrate with the unconscious. But the archetypal dynamics of separation and reunion follow the fundamental polarity of masculine and feminine principles. This gendering has been one of the most controversial aspects of Neumann's work, especially as feminist psychology developed in later decades. Critics argue that associating consciousness with masculine and unconscious with feminine reinforces patriarchal stereotypes, implying that women are less conscious or that consciousness itself is male. Neumann clearly did not intend this. He emphasized that women must develop ego consciousness just as men must, and that men must integrate the feminine just as women must integrate the masculine. But the symbolic language he used, like Jung's, carries implications difficult to disentangle from cultural assumptions about gender. Let us consider how Jung and Neumann would approach a specific psychological situation differently to make concrete the abstract differences in their frameworks. Imagine a man in his early 40s coming to analysis with a profound crisis of meaning. His career is successful but feels empty. His marriage is stable but lacks passion. He experiences vague depression and recurrent dreams of being lost in dark forests or drowning in vast oceans. In one particularly striking dream, he encounters a beautiful but terrifying woman who leads him toward a deep cave, and he wakes in panic before entering. Jung would approach this situation through amplification and active imagination. He would ask the man to describe the dream figure in detail, then would amplify the image of the feminine figure leading toward a cave by bringing in parallel images from mythology. Persephone leading souls to the underworld, Ishtar descending to the realm of death, Circe on her island, the Lady of the Lake, the Norns at the Well of Fate. He would show the man that this figure is an anima manifestation, the man's own soul image, appearing to guide him inward toward the unconscious. The cave in the dream represents the unconscious itself, the hidden depths that the man's conscious life has been avoiding. The fear he feels is natural. Ego always fears its dissolution in the vastness of the unconscious, but the dream's invitation suggests that transformation requires this descent. Jung might encourage active imagination, asking the man to re-enter the dream imaginatively, to dialogue with the figure, to ask her who she is and what she wants, to voluntarily follow her into the cave and see what is discovered there. Jung would also explore the man's personal associations. What does the dark forest remind him of? When has he felt lost like this before? Are there childhood memories associated with the feeling of drowning? Jung would weave together personal history and archetypal imagery, showing how the man's unique life story is being shaped by transpersonal patterns, how his current crisis participates in the ancient mystery of death and rebirth that all humans face. Jung might also bring in alchemical imagery, showing the man illustrations from medieval texts where the adept descends into dark waters, undergoes dissolution, and is reborn in purified form. He would explain the concept of nigredo, the blackening, the necessary depression and loss of the false self that precedes transformation. He would help the man understand that his symptoms are not just problems to eliminate, but meaningful expressions of the psyche's push toward wholeness, toward including dimensions of experience his conscious identity has excluded. Throughout this work, Jung would not suggest the man is at a particular stage in a developmental sequence. He would treat the appearance of the anima and the call to descent as specific to this man's current situation, as the psyche's response to this particular one-sidedness in this life at this moment. The archetypal pattern is universal, but its activation is individual and contextual. Neumann would see the same dream through his developmental lens. He would recognize that the man's crisis represents the limitations of patriarchal ego consciousness that has dominated his life so far. The man has successfully established himself in career and family, has achieved the goals of ego identity and social adaptation, but has done so by one-sidedly identifying with masculine consciousness, rationality, achievement, control, and by repressing the feminine principle, both within himself and in his external relationships. The dream figure and the cave represent the feminine, unconscious that the man must now reintegrate at a higher level. This is not regression to Euroboric fusion, but the beginning of the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage between conscious ego and unconscious depths. The man is being called to the psychological equivalent of what mythologically appears as the hero's descent to the underworld or his encounter with the goddess. Neumann might trace the mythological parallels more historically and sequentially than Jung. He might tell the man about Osiris descending to the underworld and being resurrected through Isis's magic, about Dionysus torn apart and reassembled, about the mysteries of Eleusis where initiates experience death and rebirth in the embrace of the goddess. He would show that the man's personal crisis participates in humanity's long struggle to move beyond one-sided patriarchal consciousness toward integration with the feminine. Neumann would also contextualize this developmentally. He would suggest that the man's ego, established through the hero phase of his 20s and 30s, is now being called to transformation. The fear of the cave is the hero ego's fear of surrendering control, of acknowledging the limits of rational consciousness. But midlife, for Neumann as for Jung, is precisely when this transformation becomes necessary and possible. The stable ego achieved in youth can now risk opening to the unconscious without fear of complete dissolution. The practical work might not differ greatly: active imagination, amplification, dream work, exploring the man's relationship with women and with his own inner feminine qualities. But the framing would be different. Neumann would place the man's experience within a comprehensive developmental narrative, showing how his crisis represents a predictable and necessary transition from hero consciousness toward the sacred marriage stage. This could be reassuring, normalizing the crisis as part of a larger pattern, or it could feel overly schematic, reducing individual suffering to a category. Another key area where Jung and Neumann converge and diverge concerns the relationship between individual psychology and collective culture. Jung certainly recognized that individual psyche and collective culture influence each other. He wrote extensively about the spirit of the age, the collective psychological atmosphere of different eras. He saw World War II as a collective psychological catastrophe, a massive eruption of the shadow in European culture. He worried about the psychological effects of technology, materialism, and the loss of religious symbolism in modern life. But Jung's primary focus remained on individual individuation. He believed that cultural transformation happens through individuals doing their inner work, becoming conscious of their shadows and complexes, integrating archetypal contents, realizing the self. If enough individuals individuate, the collective psyche gradually transforms, but collective movements, mass ideologies, and political programs that try to transform society directly without first transforming individual consciousness were, in Jung's view, dangerous and destined to activate the shadow in catastrophic ways. The Nazi and communist movements were attempts at collective transformation that bypassed individual consciousness and became possessed by archetypal forces, inflating egos to monstrous proportions, while projecting the shadow onto scapegoat groups. Neumann, shaped by his experience of historical catastrophe, placed more emphasis on collective consciousness evolution. While he certainly valued individual analysis and individuation, he saw personal psychological work as part of a larger historical movement toward new forms of consciousness. His book on the new ethic was an explicit attempt to articulate how consciousness itself must evolve collectively to prevent future catastrophes. Neumann argued that Western culture had reached the limits of one-sided, patriarchal consciousness. The ecological crisis, the dehumanization of industrial capitalism, the catastrophes of total war and genocide, all reflected the bankruptcy of consciousness that separated itself from nature and the unconscious, that tried to dominate through reason and will without acknowledging the shadow or integrating the feminine. A new form of consciousness was emerging, one that preserved ego autonomy while reintegrating with the unconscious, that honored both masculine and feminine principles, that accepted responsibility for the shadow rather than projecting it. This was not a program, but a psychological reality working itself out through millions of individual lives, through cultural movements like depth psychology, through new forms of spirituality, through the nascent ecological and feminist movements. Neumann saw his theoretical work as articulating what was already happening at the collective level, naming the evolutionary direction that consciousness was taking. Jung was more ambivalent about such grand historical narratives. He recognized currents in culture, but resisted the language of consciousness evolution toward higher stages, which sounded too much like the progressive ideologies of the 19th century that had collapsed so disastrously in the 20th. Jung tended to emphasize cycles, compensations, and the eternal return of archetypal patterns rather than directional evolution. Yet there is a paradox here, because Jung's own concept of individuation does imply development toward greater wholeness, toward integration that produces qualitatively different consciousness than immature ego identification. The person who has truly individuated, who has integrated the shadow and encountered the self, does have a different quality of consciousness than someone who remains identified with persona and ego. Jung simply resisted making this into a collective historical claim, preferring to see it as a possibility available in any era for those who undertook the inner work. The question of the feminine is particularly significant in the Jung-Neumann dialogue. Jung's relationship to the feminine was complex and has been much debated. He developed the concepts of anima and animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche. In a man, the anima is the feminine soul image, appearing in dreams as woman or goddess, guiding the man toward his own unconscious depths. In a woman, the animus is the masculine aspect, appearing as male figures, providing spirit, opinion, conviction. Jung recognized 4 stages of anima development in men. First, as Eve, the purely biological feminine. Second, as Helen, the romantic and aesthetic feminine. Third, as Mary, the spiritual and religious feminine. Fourth, as Sophia, wisdom herself. This suggested a developmental sequence from instinct to spirit, though Jung emphasized these stages could overlap and recur. But Jung wrote little about corresponding stages for the animus in women, and his writings on women's psychology have been criticized as limited by the assumptions of his era. He sometimes suggested that women naturally have less ego consciousness than men, that their connection to the unconscious is more immediate, that their psychology centers on relationship while men's centers on achievement. These characterizations, even if meant archetypally rather than literally, reinforced gender stereotypes. Neumann expanded Jung's treatment of the feminine far beyond what Jung himself accomplished. His exhaustive study of the Great Mother archetype brought together material from prehistoric archaeology, ancient goddess religions, medieval Christianity, and modern dreams and fantasies to create a comprehensive phenomenology of feminine archetypal symbolism. He showed the extraordinary complexity and richness of the feminine principle in psyche and culture, far more than Jung's relatively brief discussions of the mother archetype and anima. Moreover, Neumann argued that the feminine must be understood not just as the contrasexual other for men, but as a fundamental archetypal structure affecting all consciousness. The Great Mother is not just a man's anima projection, but the original matrix of consciousness itself, the ground from which all ego emerges. Both men and women have their origins in this matrix, and must individuate through separation from and eventual reintegration with the maternal ground of being. Neumann's emphasis on the psychological necessity of eventually honoring and integrating the feminine principle was prescient. Writing in the 1940s and 50s, before second-wave feminism, he articulated that patriarchal consciousness had become one-sided and destructive, that cultural evolution required revaluing the feminine. This was more explicit and emphatic than Jung, who certainly recognized the importance of the anima and the feminine principle, but did not frame it so centrally as a collective cultural imperative. Yet, Neumann retained the language of masculine consciousness and feminine unconscious that Jung had used, and this language remains problematic. When consciousness is gendered masculine and unconscious feminine, the implication, despite all caveats, is that men are more naturally conscious and women more naturally connected to the unconscious. Neumann tried to avoid this by insisting that women must also develop ego consciousness and that men must integrate the unconscious, but the fundamental symbolic equation remains difficult. Later, Jungian analysts, Particularly feminist Jungian analysts have worked to reformulate these concepts in ways that honor the insights about consciousness and unconscious, ego and self, without gendering them in ways that replicate patriarchal biases. Some have suggested speaking of separating and uniting principles, of discriminating and integrating functions, without assigning gender to these archetypal dynamics. Others have explored specifically feminine patterns of ego development that differ from the male hero myth, such as the descent of Inanna or the journey of Psyche, which involve different relationships to the feminine than the hero's battle against the mother. This is ongoing work, but it represents a tension in the Jung-Neumann dialogue that cannot be simply resolved. Both thinkers were products of their time, influenced by assumptions about gender that subsequent generations have questioned, yet both also articulated insights about the psychological dynamics of consciousness and unconscious, the necessity of integrating opposites, and the limitations of one-sided rational ego consciousness that remain valuable beyond their specific formulations. Another area of convergence and divergence concerns the relationship between psyche and matter, between psychological and physical reality. Jung devoted enormous attention to this question, particularly in his later work on synchronicity. Synchronicity refers to meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by normal causality. A patient dreams of a golden scarab, and at that moment, such a beetle taps on the consulting room window, or a person thinks of a long-lost friend and immediately receives an unexpected letter from them, or mythic images in dreams precede corresponding events in external reality. Jung proposed that synchronicity reveals a connection between psyche and world deeper than causality. He drew on physics, particularly the work of Wolfgang Pauli, to suggest that at some fundamental level, psyche and matter are two aspects of one underlying reality, what he called the unus mundus, the unitary world. Archetypes, in this speculative view, are not just psychological but psychoid. They pattern both inner psychological experience and outer physical events. This was Jung, at his most mystical and speculative, moving beyond empirical psychology toward a comprehensive metaphysics. He never fully systematized these ideas, leaving them suggestive rather than definitive, but they reflected his conviction that the psyche is not merely subjective, but participates in objective reality in ways that Western dualism of mind and matter cannot accommodate. Neumann, as far as we know, did not pursue the question of synchronicity and the psychoid nature of archetypes as Jung did. His focus remained more clearly psychological and historical, tracing the development of consciousness through myth and culture. Yet Neumann's framework implies a similar underlying unity. If consciousness historically emerges from the unconscious, and if the unconscious is not purely personal, but collective and archetypal, then consciousness is not separate from nature, but arises from within nature, as a part of the larger whole becoming aware of itself. Neumann's Ouroboros, the original wholeness before differentiation, resembles Jung's unus mundus, the unity preceding the split between subject and object, psyche and world, and Neumann's ultimate goal of the sacred marriage, the conscious reunion of separated opposites, implies a return to unity at a higher level, where consciousness and unconscious, psyche and world, are experienced as ultimately one while maintaining their differentiation. But Neumann articulated this more as developmental psychology than as metaphysics. He was less concerned with whether archetypes exist objectively in nature, and more concerned with how consciousness experiences its relationship to the unconscious depths over time. This makes Neumann's work more accessible to those uncomfortable with Jung's mystical speculations, but it also narrows the scope, staying within the bounds of psychological description rather than venturing into the larger questions of the nature of reality. One of the most beautiful aspects of the Jung-Neumann dialogue is the resonance between Jung's alchemical studies and Neumann's mythological framework. Jung spent decades studying medieval and Renaissance alchemy, seeing, in the cryptic symbolic language of the alchemists, a projection of psychological transformation processes. The alchemists spoke of transforming base lead into gold, of the nigredo or blackening, of the conjunctio or union of opposites, of the philosophical stone that is found by the wise but trampled by fools. Jung argued that the alchemists, without knowing it, were projecting the process of individuation onto matter. The base material represents the initial state of consciousness identified with ego and persona. The various operations, calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, represent stages of psychological transformation. The breaking down of ego inflation, the dissolution in the unconscious, the discrimination of opposites, the eventual union. The philosophical stone or gold represents the self, the wholeness achieved through the transformation process. Neumann's developmental framework parallels the alchemical process remarkably. The Ouroboros corresponds to the prima materia, the original undifferentiated substance. The separation of consciousness from unconscious corresponds to the alchemical separation operations, creating distinct elements from the original mixture. The hero's battle against the dragon corresponds to the difficult operations of calcination and mortificatio, the death of the old form. And the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, is precisely what the alchemists called the conjunctio, the union of masculine sun, king, sulfur, with feminine moon, queen, Mercury, producing the divine child, or philosophical stone, as the fruit of the union. Both Jung and Neumann saw in these symbolic systems alchemy, mythology, religious mysticism, evidence of a universal psychological pattern. The psyche, seeking wholeness, generates symbolic images of its own transformation process. Different cultures and eras produce different imagery, but the underlying pattern remains constant. Original unity, separation into opposites, tension and conflict, eventual reunion at a higher level. Where they differ is that Jung saw this as a timeless pattern available in any era, while Neumann saw it as also describing a historical progression. For Jung, an alchemist in the 14th century and a person in therapy in the 20th century could both undergo the full transformation symbolized by the alchemical opus. For Neumann, the alchemical symbolism itself represented a particular historical stage of consciousness, emerging in late medieval and Renaissance Europe, as patriarchal consciousness began to seek reintegration with the feminine and the unconscious after centuries of one-sided spiritual transcendence. Neumann might say that the alchemists were, collectively and symbolically, working out the transition from the hero stage to the sacred marriage stage, that their cryptic images encoded humanity's groping toward a new form of consciousness that could hold spirit and matter, masculine and feminine together. Jung would agree with this, but would insist that the pattern is eternally available, that any sufficiently conscious person in any era could undergo the complete transformation. Another significant difference appears in how Jung and Neumann related to Eastern religions and philosophies. Jung had extensive engagement with Eastern thought, particularly through his collaboration with Richard Wilhelm on the translation and commentary of the I Ching and The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Taoist alchemical text. Jung also wrote commentaries on Tibetan Buddhism and Zen, exploring parallels and differences between Eastern practices and Western analytical psychology. Jung recognized that Eastern traditions had developed sophisticated technologies of consciousness that Western psychology was only beginning to discover. Meditation, yoga, mandala contemplation, these practices worked directly with psyche in ways that paralleled depth psychology's goals of consciousness expansion and self-realization. Jung saw the self, the archetype of wholeness, as corresponding to what Eastern traditions called Atman, Buddha nature, or the Tao, the deepest center of being that is simultaneously individual and universal. But Jung also insisted on crucial differences between Eastern and Western approaches. Eastern practices often aimed at dissolving ego, transcending personality, merging individual consciousness into the cosmic whole. This made sense in cultures where ego consciousness had never differentiated as sharply from collective and cosmic consciousness as it had in the West. But Jung argued that Western people must first establish ego consciousness firmly before attempting to transcend it. The Western path to the self requires the ego to remain intact as a center of consciousness, even while it recognizes its relativity to the larger self. Neumann's framework provides a developmental interpretation of this difference. Eastern cultures, in Neumann's view, had retained more connection to Euroboric and matriarchal consciousness. They had not developed patriarchal consciousness to the extreme one-sided rationality that characterized the modern West. Therefore, their spiritual practices could focus on dissolution of ego boundaries and return to oceanic consciousness without the danger of pathological regression that such practices might entail for Western people, whose entire cultural development emphasized ego differentiation and individual identity. This is a controversial interpretation, potentially Eurocentric in its assumptions, and both Jung and Neumann have been criticized for viewing Eastern traditions through Western developmental lenses rather than on their own terms. Yet there is something to their observation that importing Eastern practices into Western culture requires careful discernment, that what works for consciousness shaped by Buddhist or Hindu cultures may not transfer directly to consciousness shaped by Judeo-Christian and Enlightenment traditions. The practical implications of the Jung-Neumann dialogue appear most clearly in therapeutic work. Jungian analysis, as Jung practiced and taught it, involves several key elements: dream interpretation through amplification, active imagination as dialogue with unconscious figures, attention to transference and countertransference as symbolic processes, identification and integration of complexes and shadow, an eventual encounter with the self through symbolism and synchronicity. Jung's approach was individual and intuitive, following the symbolic productions of each patient's psyche without imposing a predetermined map. He trusted the unconscious to generate images and experiences appropriate to each person's development, and the analyst's task was to facilitate consciousness's relationship to these unconscious productions without directing them toward particular goals. Neumann's developmental framework offered something Jung's approach sometimes lacked: a comprehensive map. A Jungian analyst, trained in Neumann's ideas, could recognize where a patient was in the developmental sequence, stuck in Euroboric fusion with the mother, struggling with hero separation, regressing from rigid patriarchal consciousness, beginning the sacred marriage, and could use this understanding to guide the work more intentionally. This could be helpful, giving both analyst and patient orientation in the sometimes bewildering landscape of inner work. Understanding that depression might represent the Negredo stage before transformation, that aggressive dreams might signal the hero's necessary battle for autonomy, that erotic imagery might signal the anima calling toward integration. These framings help make sense of disturbing or confusing material. But there was also danger in applying Neumann's framework too rigidly. The psyche resists being mapped too precisely. Jung's more open-ended, imaginal approach honored the irreducible individuality and unpredictability of each person's process. Neumann's more systematic approach risked becoming Procrustean, cutting individual experience to fit predetermined categories. The best Jungian work, then and now, probably uses Neumann's framework lightly, as one possible interpretive lens among others, helpful for orientation but not confused with the territory itself. The map is not the landscape, and Neumann himself would likely have agreed, having been a subtle and skillful clinician who, despite his theoretical systematization, remained responsive to the unique symbolic language of each patient's psyche. A particularly poignant dimension of the Jung-Neumann dialogue concerns suffering and redemption. Both men lived through the catastrophes of the 20th century, though from different positions. Jung, in neutral Switzerland, was spared the direct violence, but witnessed the spiritual catastrophe of European culture tearing itself apart. Neumann, as a German Jew, lost his homeland, his language, countless relatives and friends, and lived the rest of his life displaced, carrying the trauma of what had been done to his people. How does analytical psychology address such suffering? What resources does depth psychology offer in the face of collective trauma and evil? Jung's answer was complex. He insisted that evil is real, not merely the absence of good, but a positive force in the psyche and the world. The shadow, both personal and collective, contains genuine destructiveness that cannot be simply dissolved through consciousness, but must be confronted and contained. Jung saw in Job's encounter with Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible a profound wrestling with divine darkness, with the shadow side of God, and he argued that Christianity's attempt to split God into purely good Father and evil Satan had created a dangerous imbalance that inevitably led to the projection of evil onto others. Jung's concept of the self included both light and dark, creative and destructive. The encounter with the self involved accepting this totality, holding the tension of opposites rather than identifying with one pole and repressing the other. Redemption, in Jung's psychology, came not through transcending evil, but through conscious suffering, through the ego's willingness to contain the tension of opposites until a transcendent third emerged. This is the meaning of the alchemical axiom that Jung loved. In Sterculini's Invenator, in filth it will be found. The gold is found in the dung heap. The treasure is hidden in the darkness. Transformation comes through descending into the shadow, not fleeing from it. Jung's Christ figure was not the triumphant risen Lord, but the crucified one, the suffering servant who descends to hell and carries human sin and darkness. Neumann, writing after the Holocaust, tried to articulate a new ethic adequate to the catastrophe. His argument was that traditional morality, based on identifying with good and repressing evil, had catastrophically failed. The Nazi perpetrators were often people who consciously identified as good, moral, obedient citizens. They could commit atrocities because they projected all evil onto the scapegoated Jews, seeing themselves as purifying the world of contamination. The rigidity of conventional morality, which does not tolerate ambiguity or shadow consciousness, made people vulnerable to possession by the shadow when external circumstances weakened normal restraints. Neumann's new ethic required accepting personal responsibility for the shadow. Instead of saying, "I am good, and evil is outside me and those others," conscious ethics requires saying, "I contain evil, I am capable of destructiveness, and I must take responsibility for this darkness within myself." This does not mean acting on evil impulses, but rather acknowledging them consciously, withdrawing projections from scapegoats, and containing one's own darkness rather than inflicting it on others. This is demanding work, requiring psychological maturity and courage. It is easier to project the shadow onto others and feel righteous in attacking them, but Neumann argued that only this difficult inner work could prevent future collective catastrophes. If enough individuals accepted responsibility for their shadows, collective scapegoating mechanisms would lose power, and the escalation into genocidal violence could be prevented. Jung agreed with this direction, but worried about Neumann's framing. He felt Neumann risks suggesting that conscious acceptance of the shadow was a new stage of evolution beyond traditional morality, which could be misunderstood as relativism or license. Jung insisted that true morality deepens rather than replaces traditional ethics, that the encounter with the self generates a more profound ethical responsibility, not liberation from moral constraint. This tension reflects a difference in emphasis. Neumann, having witnessed the failure of conventional morality in the face of Nazism, wanted to articulate how consciousness must evolve beyond simplistic good-evil dichotomies. Jung, always cautious about anything that might weaken moral responsibility, wanted to emphasize that accepting the shadow requires greater, not lesser, ethical engagement. Both were responding to the same catastrophe, seeking to understand how psychology might contribute to preventing its recurrence. Their answers converge on the necessity of shadow integration, on withdrawing projections, on accepting personal darkness rather than inflicting it collectively. But their language and emphasis differ in ways that reflect their different positions. Neumann as survivor in exile, Jung as witness from a distance. Let us now drift into more reflective, contemplative spaces, allowing the dialogue between these two minds to illuminate broader questions about the nature of consciousness, the human condition, and the great mysteries that psychology approaches but never fully captures. There is something deeply moving about two minds reaching toward the same truth from different angles, each seeing aspects invisible to the other, each contributing to a larger vision that neither alone could articulate. Jung and Neumann were engaged in this complementary seeing, this stereo vision of the psyche that produces depth through the parallax between two perspectives. Jung saw consciousness as eternal possibility, archetypes as structures always available, the self as goal and ground simultaneously present in every moment. His vision was synchronic, seeing the totality spread out in timeless patterns, each part reflecting the whole like a hologram. A dream contains everything: personal, history, archetypal depths, perspective guidance. A symptom reveals a complex, which connects to the shadow, which opens to the collective unconscious, which leads to the self. Everything interpenetrates everything. Neumann saw consciousness as historical emergence, archetypes as stages in a developmental sequence, the self as achieved through progressive integration. His vision was diachronic, seeing the totality unfolding through time, earlier stages containing later ones, potentially later stages transcending and including earlier ones, actually. Development has direction from unconscious to conscious, from fusion to differentiation to integration, from Ouroboros to hero to sacred marriage. Which vision is true? Perhaps this is the wrong question. Perhaps consciousness is both timeless and temporal, both synchronic structure and diachronic process. At every moment, all archetypal possibilities are present. Yet, which ones activate and how consciousness relates to them depends on developmental and historical context. The infant does experience the self through the divine child archetype, yet the infant's relationship to the self differs from the elder's because consciousness itself has evolved through the lifespan. We might say that Jung's vision privileges the vertical axis, the depth dimension, the eternal structures underlying temporal manifestations. Neumann's vision privileges the horizontal axis, the temporal dimension, the historical unfolding of consciousness through stages. Both dimensions are real, and complete psychology requires both. This parallels the difference between Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics. Plato saw eternal forms as the true reality, with temporal existence as shadows of these unchanging archetypes. Aristotle saw potentials actualized through time, with developmental unfolding as the fundamental reality. Western thought has oscillated between these poles for millennia, and Jung and Neumann recapitulate this ancient dialogue within psychology. The mystery they both gesture toward is the relationship between the individual soul and the larger patterns it expresses. When a person dreams of a great mother figure, is this the individual psyche generating a personal symbol, or is the archetype using the individual psyche to manifest itself, or are these two descriptions of the same event from different angles? Jung tended toward the latter view. Archetypes are autonomous, and individual consciousness is their theater of manifestation. Neumann emphasized individual development while still recognizing archetypal structures. This connects to the perennial question of fate and freedom. If archetypes are autonomous powers shaping consciousness from beyond ego control, is the individual merely a puppet of these larger forces? Jung would say no consciousness has the freedom to become aware of archetypal influences and to relate to them consciously, rather than being identified with them unconsciously. Neumann would add that this capacity for conscious relationship to archetypes itself develops historically and individually, that consciousness gradually wins freedom from blind archetypal possession through the developmental process, but neither believed in absolute freedom. Both recognized that consciousness emerges from and remains grounded in the unconscious, that the ego is a relatively small and recent development floating on vast depths of psyche that operate according to their own laws. The goal is not to escape these depths, but to establish conscious relationship with them, to dialogue between the finite ego and the infinite unconscious, producing a life that honors both. This is the meaning of individuation, not individualism, not ego inflation, not separation from the collective, but the realization of one's unique being as an expression of universal patterns. The paradox is that the more deeply one contacts the personal, the more one discovers the transpersonal. The most intimate truth of an individual life reveals archetypal depths shared by all humanity. The most unique creative expression channels collective symbolism. Jung and Neumann both understood this paradox from different angles. We might consider the relationship between consciousness and cosmos. Modern Western thought tends toward dualism or reductive materialism. Either consciousness is a separate substance mysteriously connected to matter, or consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of material brain processes. Neither Jung nor Neumann accepted these alternatives. Both saw consciousness as continuous with nature, emerging from within the cosmos rather than imposed on it from outside. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious implies that psyche is not limited to individual brains, but is a dimension of reality as fundamental as space and time. If archetypes are universal structures appearing across all cultures and epochs, then they cannot be produced by individual brains, but must be inherited potentials, patterns, in the very fabric of existence. This led Jung to speculate about the psychoid nature of archetypes, their existence at a level where psyche and matter have not yet differentiated. Neumann's developmental framework suggests that consciousness is the cosmos becoming aware of itself through the process of evolution. First, matter organizes into living cells. Then life develops nervous systems capable of sensation and perception. Then consciousness emerges in animals and develops further in humans. Then ego consciousness separates from unconscious participation. Then consciousness begins to reintegrate with its origins at a higher level. The entire sequence is the universe waking up, developing capacity to know itself. This is reminiscent of Teilhard de Chardin's vision of evolution moving toward the omega point, or Hegel's phenomenology of spirit coming to self-knowledge through history. Neumann was influenced by such evolutionary and idealist philosophies, while Jung was more cautious about them. But both recognize that human consciousness is not separate from nature, but is nature's self-reflection, matter become conscious of itself. This has profound implications. It means that psychological work is not merely subjective, not just rearranging private mental contents, but is participation in the cosmos's own developmental process. When an individual integrates their shadow, they contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself. When someone achieves individuation, realizing the self, they actualize a potential that serves not just their personal fulfillment but the cosmos's movement towards self-awareness. Both Jung and Neumann retained a sense of the sacred, of consciousness as related to something ultimate and holy. This was not traditional theism, neither believed in a supernatural God separate from nature, but both experienced the self, the archetype of wholeness, as numinous, as having the quality of divinity. Jung spoke of the God image in the psyche, carefully distinguishing this from claims about God's existence as a metaphysical entity. He insisted that psychology can only speak about religious experience, about how the sacred is experienced in psyche, not about the objective existence of God. Yet Jung also admitted, in his late interview for the BBC, that he did not merely believe in God, but knew God, experienced the reality directly. This knowledge came not from intellectual argument, but from encounter with the self, with the archetypal depths that contain and exceed ego consciousness. For Jung, the self is the God image within, and whether there is a God beyond this image is a question psychology cannot answer, but also need not answer, because the experienced reality is what matters for life. Neumann was more explicitly mystical, more willing to speak of the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, as not just psychological integration, but as participation in divine creativity, the reunion of consciousness and unconscious, masculine and feminine, ego and self, recapitulates and participates in the creative union that generates the cosmos itself. This is why sacred sexuality appears in so many mystical traditions. It is not just metaphor, but recognition that the creative union of opposites in human consciousness and bodies reflects and participates in the generative mystery of existence. Both men stood in the Western esoteric tradition that includes Gnosticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, Christian mysticism traditions that saw divine creativity working through symbols, opposites, and transformation. They translated this perennial wisdom into psychological language, making it accessible to modern consciousness, but they never reduced it to merely psychological. The archetypes are psychological, but they are also more than psychological. The self is psychological, but also transpersonal, cosmic, divine. This means that analytical psychology, at its deepest, is a spiritual discipline as much as a therapeutic method. The work of knowing oneself, of confronting the shadow, of integrating the anima or animus, of following the path of individuation toward the self, this work is simultaneously psychological healing and spiritual realization. Therapy becomes pilgrimage. Analysis becomes mystical initiation. The consulting room becomes sacred temenos, the space where transformation occurs. Jung and Neumann both understood this, though they expressed it differently according to their temperaments and contexts. Jung, trained as a medical doctor, retained scientific language and empirical caution even while exploring mystical territory. Neumann, trained in philosophy as well as medicine, was perhaps more willing to speak poetically and metaphysically about the spiritual dimensions of psychological development. The question of myth deserves deeper reflection. Both men saw myths not as primitive superstitions or entertaining stories, but as profound expressions of psychological truth, as the psyche's own language for describing its structures and processes. But why does the psyche speak in stories and images rather than abstractions and concepts? The answer seems to be that the psyche's deepest reality is symbolic rather than literal, imaginal rather than conceptual. Archetypes cannot be directly known or spoken. They are structures of experiencing rather than objects of experience. We never encounter the mother archetype itself, only its myriad manifestations, our personal mother, dream figures, goddess images, natural symbols like earth and ocean, patterns of feeling and relationship. The archetype is the invisible pattern organizing these manifestations. Myths provide narratives that allow consciousness to orient itself within the archetypal landscape. The hero's journey gives a map for ego development. The descent to the underworld provides a pattern for encountering unconscious depths. The sacred marriage offers an image of the goal toward which psyche moves. These stories do not describe external historical events, but internal psychological realities, yet they are no less true for being symbolic rather than literal. Both Jung and Neumann practiced mythological amplification, surrounding contemporary psychological experiences with parallels from world mythology to reveal their archetypal dimensions. A patient's dream of being swallowed by a whale becomes resonant with Jonah in the belly of the fish, with Pinocchio inside the whale, with countless mythic heroes who are devoured and reborn, and through these parallels the dream's meaning deepens from personal event to participation in the universal pattern of death and rebirth. But Neumann added the historical dimension, suggesting that different myths predominate at different stages of consciousness development. Creation myths involving the Great Mother appear in cultures at the matricentric stage. Hero myths, fighting dragons, appear when patriarchal consciousness is establishing itself. Sacred marriage myths appear when cultures seek integration of masculine and feminine principles. This means myths not only reveal timeless patterns but also reflect historical stages of consciousness evolution. This adds another layer to mythological interpretation. A contemporary person dreaming of goddess figures might be experiencing the Great Mother archetype, but they are also, in Neumann's framework, reconnecting with a stage of consciousness that their culture has largely transcended and repressed, and the dream may signal the necessity of retrieving and integrating this earlier wisdom at a new level. The relationship between psychology and art illuminates another facet of the Jung-Neumann dialogue. Both men were deeply concerned with artistic creativity as expression of and encounter with archetypal depths. Jung wrote extensively on art and literature, analyzing works by authors like Goethe and James Joyce, and he encouraged patients to paint their dreams and fantasies, seeing artistic expression as a form of active imagination that makes unconscious contents visible. Neumann's first major work was on the ontological sources of artistic creation, and he continued throughout his life to explore how art mediates between conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. His study of the Great Mother included extensive analysis of artistic representations of the goddess from prehistory through the Renaissance, showing how artists across cultures gave form to archetypal patterns. Both recognized that great art does not merely express personal psychology, but taps into collective depths, giving form to archetypal contents that resonate across humanity. This is why truly original art often feels paradoxically familiar. It reveals patterns we did not consciously know, but immediately recognize when seen. The artist, like the shaman or prophet, is one who can descend into the collective unconscious and bring back images and stories that others need but cannot access alone. Yet there is a distinction between art and psychology. Art gives form to unconscious contents, but does not necessarily make them conscious. The artist may channel archetypal material without understanding it psychologically. The observer may be deeply moved by a painting or story without knowing why. Psychology seeks to bring consciousness to these processes, to understand what art expresses, to make explicit the implicit archetypal patterns. Neumann suggested that art represents an intermediate stage between unconscious archetypal expression and fully conscious psychological understanding. Prehistoric cave paintings of animals and shamanic figures express numinous encounter with the sacred, but without ego consciousness's capacity for reflection. Modern art often expresses psychological contents more consciously, sometimes explicitly exploring themes of consciousness and identity. In psychological writing like Jung's and Neumann's own attempts to articulate in concepts what art expresses in images. This is a developmental sequence from unconscious expression through symbolic representation to conscious understanding. But again, it is not simply progressive art retains capacities that psychology loses. The painting or story expresses the living reality in ways that conceptual analysis inevitably reduces. Jung knew this, which is why his own writing remained richly metaphorical and imagistic, resisting purely abstract formulation. Neumann also wrote with poetic depth, honoring the primacy of symbol even while analyzing it. The question of death and transformation appears differently in Jung and Neumann. Jung encountered death throughout his work in alchemical symbolism of mortificatio and putrefaction, in hero myths of descent to the underworld, in patients' dreams of dying and being reborn, in his own confrontation with mortality during his illness in 1944, when he had near-death experiences of extraordinary beauty and meaning. For Jung, death is not merely physical cessation but a psychological reality, the death of ego identification, the dissolution of the false self, the necessary darkness before rebirth. Every transformation requires dying to the old and being reborn to the new. The self cannot be realized without ego's willingness to die, to surrender its illusion of supremacy and control. The mystical traditions speak of dying before death, the voluntary ego death that opens to transpersonal reality. Jung saw this as the essence of transformation. Neumann's framework gives developmental specificity to this. The death symbolism appears differently at different stages. In the Ouroboros stage, death means reabsorption into the undifferentiated matrix, loss of any separate identity. In the Great Mother stage, death is return to the mother, to earth and nature, terrifying to emerging consciousness but also secretly desired. In the hero stage, death is the enemy to fight and overcome, the dragon to slay, and the hero's consciousness rigidly defends against dissolution. Only at the stage of reintegration, the sacred marriage, can death be accepted as transformation rather than annihilation, as return to the source while maintaining consciousness. Both men wrote during and after humanity's encounter with death on an unprecedented scale, the two world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, millions of deaths, cultural death, the threat of human extinction. This collective confrontation with mortality surely influenced their thinking. Jung's insistence that consciousness must accept death as part of life, must integrate the reality of endings and loss, was not abstract but existentially urgent. Neumann's new ethic, requiring acceptance of the shadow, was motivated by the necessity of preventing future mass death. Yet both also saw death symbolism in individual lives that had nothing to do with physical death. The death of a relationship, the loss of a career, the end of youth, the collapse of a worldview, these are psychological deaths requiring mourning and transformation. The psyche treats these endings with the same symbolism it uses for physical death, and the same psychological work is required, accepting the loss, allowing the play, dissolution, trusting the possibility of renewal. This connects to the theme of sacrifice. Jung wrote extensively about sacrifice, particularly in transformation symbolism in the Mass, analyzing Christian ritual as symbolic death and rebirth. The sacrifice is the ego's surrender to the self, the offering of personal will to transpersonal wholeness. Every transformation requires sacrifice, giving up what one has been to become what one is called to be. Neumann understood sacrifice as necessary at each developmental transition. The Ouroboros stage must be sacrificed to emerge into individual consciousness. The Great Mother must be separated from, even symbolically slain, for ego to establish autonomy. The hero's rigid defenses must be sacrificed to allow reintegration with the unconscious. Each stage has its gifts and must be left behind, which involves loss and grief, even when the transformation is ultimately life-enhancing. Both men recognize that contemporary culture has largely lost the symbolic forms for sacrifice and transformation. Traditional religious rituals provided containers for these passages, baptism as rebirth, confirmation as taking adult identity, marriage as sacred union, funeral rites as transition. With the decline of religious participation in modern Western culture, these passages become psychological rather than collectively ritualized, and individuals must often navigate them without cultural support or symbolic framework. This is where depth psychology becomes crucial. Analysis provides a symbolic space for transformation that culture no longer offers collectively. The consulting room becomes the temenos, the sacred precinct where transformation can occur. The analyst serves as witness and guide, holding the space while the patient undergoes death and rebirth of psychic structures. The dream work, the active imagination, the exploration of symptoms, these become ritualized practices facilitating transformation. Jung and Neumann both understood that they were articulating and practicing a new form of spiritual guidance appropriate to modern consciousness. This was not organized religion with fixed doctrines and collective rituals, but individualized exploration of psyche's depths with honoring of symbolic reality and archetypal patterns. It required both the person seeking help and the person providing it to take psyche seriously, to honor dreams and symptoms as meaningful communications rather than meaningless noise, to trust that the unconscious contains wisdom that consciousness needs. This represents a profound cultural shift in how transformation is understood and facilitated. Neumann's framework contextualizes this shift historically, the movement from collective, ritualized transformation to individualized, psychological transformation reflects the evolution of consciousness toward greater individual, autonomy, and responsibility. Jung was less historical in his framing, but equally aware that analytical psychology represented a new form for ancient wisdom, a translation of perennial spiritual knowledge into language and practice accessible to modern people who could no longer simply believe in traditional religious forms. The question of masculinity and femininity deserves further reflection, as it is both central to the Jung-Neumann dialogue and deeply problematic in contemporary understanding. Both men used masculine and feminine symbolism extensively, associating consciousness with masculine and unconscious with feminine, seeing hero myths as masculine development and goddess symbolism as feminine principles. This symbolic language is rooted in biological reality. Men and women have different reproductive roles and bodies, but extends far beyond biology into metaphysics and cosmology. In this symbolic system, masculine represents separating, discriminating, penetrating, ascending, activating principles, while feminine represents uniting, gestating, receptive, descending, containing principles. Day, sun, sky, mind, spirit, logos, masculine, night, moon, earth, body, matter, eros, feminine. These are not literal descriptions of men and women, but archetypal qualities that both sexes contain and must integrate. The problem is that using gender terms for these principles inevitably reinforces cultural stereotypes and power dynamics. When consciousness is called masculine, the implication is that men are more conscious and women more unconscious, regardless of claims that these are merely symbolic associations. When heroism is framed as masculine development, women's psychological development risks being seen as derivative or less central. Feminist critics of Jung and Neumann have made these points forcefully, and contemporary Jungian psychology has worked to reformulate these concepts in less gender-bound language. Some speak of dynamic and receptive principles, or agency and communion, or yang and yin qualities, present in all people, regardless of sex. Others have explored distinctively feminine patterns of development, such as the descent of Inanna or Psyche's journey, which involve different relationships to the feminine than the male hero's battle. Yet something may be lost if the connection to gender is completely severed. Biological sex is a profound reality affecting embodied experience, and the archetypal qualities Jung and Neumann associated with masculine and feminine do have some relationship to the different ways male and female bodies exist in the world. The question is, how to honor this without reducing consciousness and psychological patterns to biological determinism or reinforcing cultural oppression. Perhaps the solution is to hold the tension, to recognize that masculine and feminine are both symbolic archetypal principles and realities connected to sexed bodies, that the connection is neither purely arbitrary nor deterministic, and that both men and women contain and must integrate both. Principles. A man must develop consciousness, masculine, but also integrate anima and relate to the unconscious, feminine. A woman must develop consciousness, masculine, and also honor her connection to archetypal feminine depths. The integration of opposites, the conjunctio, is the goal for both sexes. This is complicated by cultural history. Patriarchal cultures have systematically devalued the feminine, associated women with matter and body and unconsciousness in denigrating ways, and denied women access to education, public life, and cultural authority. Jung and Neumann wrote within this context, and however much they valued the feminine in their symbolic systems, they were still influenced by patriarchal assumptions. Neumann's emphasis on the necessity of honoring and integrating the feminine was progressive for his time, anticipating feminist insights about the destructiveness of one-sided patriarchal consciousness. But he did not question the basic framework of masculine consciousness separating from feminine unconscious, which retains problematic implications. Contemporary Jungian feminists have deepened and complicated this framework, but the questions remain open and actively debated. The image that keeps recurring in contemplating Jung and Neumann is the symbol they both revered, the tree. The tree appears throughout mythology as the world tree, Yggdrasil, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. It unites opposites' roots in dark earth, branches in bright sky, trunk connecting them. It grows through time, adding rings year by year, yet remains itself throughout its life. It is individual, yet connected through root systems to other trees, to forest, to ecosystem. Jung saw the self as tree, growing from unconscious depths toward conscious realization, integrating earth and sky, shadow and light, personal and collective. Neumann saw consciousness as tree growing through evolutionary time, its roots in the Uroboric matrix, its early growth through the Great Mother stage, its trunk rising through hero development, its branches reaching toward the sacred marriage that reunites earth and heaven. The tree is not finished, not static. It continues growing, responding to seasons and weather, shaped by environment, yet expressing inherent pattern. Both Jung and Neumann knew that consciousness is not complete, that individuation is never finally achieved in life, but remains an ongoing process of growth and integration. The goal is not to reach some perfect endpoint, but to participate consciously in the process, to honor the pattern while allowing for uncertainty and surprise. And the tree exists in relationship to soil and water, to sun and air, to other plants and animals, to the ecosystem that sustains it. Neither Jung nor Neumann saw consciousness as isolated or independent. However much they emphasized individual development, they recognized that the individual is always part of larger wholes, family, culture, humanity, nature, cosmos. The relationship between individual and collective, between personal and transpersonal, remained always in tension and always in reciprocal influence. This is perhaps the deepest convergence between their visions. Both refuse reductive individualism and reductive collectivism, holding instead that consciousness is simultaneously individual and transpersonal, unique and universal, particular and archetypal. Every truly individual expression paradoxically reveals collective depths. Every archetypal pattern manifests uniquely in each life. The universal appears through the particular, the eternal through the temporal. This is what their dialogue reveals, that psychological truth requires multiple perspectives, that no single vision captures the whole, that Jung's synchronic depth and Neumann's diachronic development are both partial truths, needing each other for completeness. Their conversation continues in those who study and practice analytical psychology, in each generation's attempt to understand consciousness more fully, more compassionately, more truthfully. And now, as we near the end of this nocturnal journey, let us rest in the mystery they both served, the mystery of consciousness itself, of awareness emerging from darkness, of the psyche's perpetual creativity, of the human capacity to know and be transformed. Jung and Neumann devoted their lives to mapping this mystery, not to explain it away, but to honor it more fully, to help others navigate its territories with wisdom and courage. Their work remains relevant because the questions they addressed are eternal. Every human still emerges from unconscious origins, still must establish individual identity while remaining connected to collective depths, still must integrate shadow and encounter self. Every culture still negotiates between tradition and innovation, between past and future, between collective values and individual needs. The patterns Jung and Neumann articulated endure because they reflect structures of consciousness itself, not merely historically contingent ideas. Yet their work is also limited and partial, shaped by the contexts in which they lived and thought. Contemporary psychology has moved beyond Jung and Neumann in many ways, incorporating neuroscience, infant development, research, trauma understanding, multicultural perspectives, feminist and post-colonial critiques. Their grand theoretical systems can seem dated, their cultural assumptions problematic, their symbolic interpretations speculative. The question is whether their core insights about archetypes and the collective unconscious, about consciousness emerging from and needing to reintegrate with its depths, about the necessity of symbolic thinking and imaginal engagement with psyche, whether these insights remain valid and valuable despite the limitations of their formulations. Most who work deeply with the psyche would say, yes, the language may need updating, the frameworks, qualifying, the assumptions, questioning, but the basic recognition that consciousness is more than ego, that psyche has depths and structures beyond personal history, that transformation requires symbolic work these truths endure. Jung and Neumann were cartographers of inner space, explorers of territories that previous Western psychology had ignored or denied. They took seriously what other psychologists dismissed as mere fantasy or symptom dreams, myths, religious experiences, creative visions. They saw in these seemingly irrational phenomena the deepest wisdom of the psyche, the symbolic communications through which the unconscious guides consciousness toward wholeness. Their work requires a shift in attitude from the stance that ego consciousness is all that matters, to the recognition that consciousness floats on and emerges from vast unconscious depths, from seeing the psyche as mechanical to experiencing it as creative and purposive, from dismissing symbols as primitive to recognizing them as the psyche's primary language. This shift is not easily made in a culture that values rationality, control, and literal thinking. But for those who make it, the psyche reveals itself as endlessly fascinating, wise, and transformative. And here, at the end of our journey, we find ourselves returned to the beginning, to the mystery of consciousness and unconscious, to the eternal questions about who we are and what we might become. Jung and Neumann did not answer these questions definitively, no one can, but they provided languages, maps, and practices that help each person engage their own depths, find their own meanings, walk their own paths toward wholeness. Their dialogue continues in every dream interpreted, every symbol contemplated, every shadow integrated, every encounter with the self. It continues in the silence of meditation, in the creativity of art, in the intimacy of love, in the suffering that cracks open the heart, in the joy that wells up from depths unknown. It continues in you, wanderer of inner territories, as you drift now toward sleep, toward the unconscious realms where transformation gestates in darkness. The conversation between these two minds has woven through this night like a river, sometimes moving swiftly over rapids of ideas, sometimes pooling in quiet eddies of reflection. We have followed its course from the biographical origins through the conceptual heart to these final contemplative reaches where analysis dissolves into silence, where words gesture toward what cannot be fully spoken. Jung, the pioneer who first mapped the collective unconscious and named the archetypes, who trusted the psyche's depths and taught others to listen to dreams and honor symbols, who held the tension of opposites until new understanding emerged. Neumann, the brilliant systematizer who gave Jung's insights developmental form, who showed consciousness emerging through evolutionary stages, who honored the Great Mother and traced her transformations, who thought deeply about culture and history and the future of consciousness. Together, they created a psychological vision rich enough to engage both intellect and imagination, scientific enough to ground itself in clinical observation, while mystical enough to recognize the sacred dimensions of psyche. Their work stands at the intersection of science and spirituality, ancient wisdom and modern discovery, offering a middle path between reductive materialism and naive supernaturalism. And their work remains unfinished, as all great work must. They opened territories that subsequent generations continue to explore, raised questions that remain vital, developed practices that continue to transform lives. The collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process of individuation, these are not dusty concepts in forgotten books, but living realities encountered fresh in every generation, by every person who ventures inward with courage and honesty. Perhaps what matters most in their dialogue is not who was right about this or that detail, but the shared commitment to honoring the psyche's depths, to taking seriously the symbolic and imaginal dimensions of experience, to trusting that consciousness can develop and transform, that wounds can heal and wholeness can emerge. This is not naive optimism, but hard-won wisdom from decades of clinical work with suffering souls, from personal journeys through darkness, from witnessing both individual and collective catastrophe and still affirming the possibility of transformation. Their legacy lives in the analysts and therapists who practice depth psychology, in artists and writers who draw from archetypal wells, in seekers who engage their own inner work through dream work and active imagination, in scholars who continue to develop and critique their ideas. The Jung-Neumann dialogue continues wherever consciousness and unconscious meet, wherever ego and self encounter each other, wherever the human soul seeks to know itself more fully. As this long night's telling draws to a close, as the words thin out towards silence and sleep, let the substance of what has been shared settle into your depths. You need not remember every detail, every concept, every mythological reference. Let it all sink down into the unconscious, where whatever is needed will be preserved and whatever is extraneous will dissolve. Trust that something has been planted in the listening, seeds that will germinate in their own time, images and ideas that will surface when you need them. Jung would say that this long telling has been an amplification surrounding the central mystery of consciousness with multiple perspectives, mythological parallels, conceptual frameworks, all circling around what cannot be directly grasped, but only approached through metaphor and symbol. Neumann would place this conversation itself as a moment in the ongoing evolution of consciousness, as later minds reflecting on earlier ones, building on their foundations while moving beyond their limitations. Both would agree that the purpose of such reflection is not merely intellectual understanding but transformation, not just knowing about the psyche but engaging it, not simply studying consciousness but developing it. Theory serves practice, concept serves experience, and all the words dissolve into the living reality of psyche seeking and finding itself. So rest now in the mystery they both served, the ancient new mystery of the soul's journey, from unconsciousness to consciousness, and back again, changed and deepened. Rest in the Great Mother's embrace, the holding darkness from which all emerges and to which all returns. Rest in the hero's journey, completed for today, the battles fought and the dragon faced. Rest in the sacred marriage of consciousness and unconscious that sleep allows, the nightly reunion of separated realms. And know that tomorrow consciousness will emerge again from the depths, carrying dreams and stirrings from the night's journey, continuing the endless process of awakening and sleeping, knowing and forgetting, separating and reuniting that is the pulse of psychic life. Jung and Neumann mapped this territory so you might navigate it more consciously, so the journey might be undertaken with understanding and purpose rather than blindly and alone. Their voices now fade into silence, their dialogue complete for this night, and you are left with your own psyche, your own depths, your own path toward wholeness. They have been companions on the journey, wise guides who walked before and left maps and stories to light the way. But the journey itself is yours, unique and unrepeatable, your own meeting with the depths, your own dialogue between consciousness and unconscious, your own realization of the self. May their wisdom support you. May their courage inspire you. May their dedication to truth guide you. And may you find in your own depths the living waters they pointed toward, the creative source that transforms and renews, the self that is both goal and ground of the whole journey. Sleep well, wanderer. Dream deeply. And know that the work of consciousness continues in darkness and in light, in sleeping and in waking, forever dying and being reborn, forever seeking and finding the wholeness that was always already present, waiting to be recognized and lived. The dialogue between Jung and Neumann flows on like an underground river, sometimes visible in scholarship and therapy, sometimes hidden in the private work of souls laboring toward consciousness, but always there, always nourishing the psyche's growth, always pointing toward the mystery that contains and exceeds all our understanding, the mystery of consciousness itself, awakening to itself, finding itself at home in the infinite depths from which it emerged and to which it eternally belongs. Welcome this homecoming. Welcome the descent into sleep as return to the source. And trust that consciousness will emerge again, renewed and ready, continuing the ancient journey that Jung and Neumann devoted their lives to understanding and serving, the journey that is at once deeply personal and utterly universal, the human soul's pilgrimage toward itself. Good night, dear traveler. May your dreams be deep and your sleep restorative. May consciousness and unconscious meet in your depths and generate new life. And may you awaken remembering that you are part of something larger, something ancient, something sacred. The ongoing evolution of consciousness that Jung and Neumann both mapped and participated in, the great work that continues in you and through you, now and always, rest.